The document in the center of the screen was published in November 1971 and ran alongside a story by Nicholas Gage, a New York Times employee. This actual document is not from the New York Times, though, but from a newspaper in Florida. The photos that will be with this chart are random pics from other newspapers from back in the General Time era. The photos of the characters that I have included in this video are not the actual bosses listed, but had some power in organized crime. Carlo Gambino, Carmine Tramonte, Aniello Delle Croce, Joe Colombo, Joseph Anthony Colombo, born June 16, 1923 in New York City. In 1970, he created the Italian-American Civil Rights League. On June 28, 1971, Mr. Colombo was shot numerous times during a rally, even though he was surrounded by thousands of people in Manhattan. Joseph suffered brain damage as a result of a bullet to the head, but stayed alive until May 22, 1978. While he may be listed here as a boss, he apparently had brain damage and was not the boss of anything. Joe's shooting was featured in the 2019 movie The Irishman, which I just watched over this past weekend and really liked. While not all entirely true, the movie was amazing and I would say great. It is on Netflix. I recommend this movie to all people. All the actors did a great job. For a more probable end to Jimmy Hoffa's life, there are other documentaries that include interviews with actual FBI and mob prosecutors that shows a more probable end to Jimmy. But regardless, The Irishman is an A+, along with The Godfather 1 and 2. It is really good. The chart has the New York mob families on the top here, but the thing that they had was organized crime and people like Russell Buffalino. While not listed here, was a member of their thing, according to reports. On the bottom here is Angelo Bruno, who ran Philadelphia until he was shot as he was being dropped off at his house on March 21, 1980. Also listed in this list is Carlos Marcello, who was featured in the Mafia News first video. According to newspaper reports and past interviews with government prosecutors, Carlos was an untouchable back in the early 1970s. State officials in Louisiana did not touch him. The federal government finally got a conviction for Carlos about a decade after this chart was published. Interestingly, there is a Los Angeles family listed here and better known bosses from Buffalo, Boston, Detroit, and of course Chicago, who have Tony Accardo and Paul DeLucia listed as acting bosses. Almost 20 years before this listing, Paul was questioned in Congress. The person asking him questions kept asking about his nickname, Paul the Waiter. After reading the testimony, it seemed clear to me that he did not like this nickname, and his irritation seemed apparent from his answers. It was probably a good idea to move on from his nickname, seeing that after being visited in federal prison by Tony Accardo, Paul was somehow released from prison years before his sentence was supposed to end. That obviously shows the political power of the Chicago mob back then. They had the money and juice to make things happen, and they did. Paul was let out of prison early, sort of like how Carlos apparently was the only person to see if you needed something in his home state. Top right of the chart shows who apparently took over for Vito Genovese after he died of natural causes in federal prison in 1969, just 2 years before this. Carmine Tramonte, a.k.a. Mr. Gribbs, born October 1, 1910 in Italy, was apparently the boss of the Lucchese crime family, and he was referenced in the movie Goodfellas. Tramonte became boss of the Lucchese family in 1967 when his boss, Tommy Lucchese, died. Carmine was indicted on November 29, 1972 for lying to a grand jury, convicted in August 1973, and was sent to state prison for 3 years. In May 1974, Mr. Tramonte was sentenced to 15 years in prison for being involved in heroin. He died in prison in 1978. In Goodfellas, he was named Gribbs. Right now, I would say that The Irishman is as good as Goodfellas, and in some ways better because the movie has so many different aspects about their life back then. I'm curious what people think. Have you seen The Irishman? And if so, is it as good as the Godfather movies, Goodfellas, Casinos? Put the answers below.